don't know how many people. Okay, so I don't know how many people we got exactly yet, but there should be more people joining us, hopefully, as we go on. So welcome to this part 2 of the state we're in, collaboration between Real Democracy Movement and the Museum of Care, which has proved very fruitful so far, and I'm sure will continue to be so. We've got 2 speakers today, the main speaker being Fernando Quintana from Chile, and he's going to be speaking to all right, I've got the wrong here. I have my notes here. Fernando will be discussing recent events and attempts to replace the Pinochet era constitution, which was imposed after the 1973 coup, which, as we know, toppled the left-wing president Salvadore Allende. And he will be examining what lessons we can draw from it. He will also be making, because of course, in the last few days, we know too that in Argentina, a far-right president was elected. So he will be giving us his observations on that. Fernando is currently studying for a PhD at Queen Mary University, London. And prior to this, he gained a degree in law and a master's in political science from the University of Chile. And so obviously he's in a great position to inform us about the Chilean situation, past and present. So then we also have Michael Rainsborough, who is a lecturer at SOAS with special interest in social movements, among other things. And he will be talking just about 5 or 6 minutes to talk about the legacy of David Graeber, the late lamented David Graeber. I think what we do is we've got about an hour and a half, I think, for the whole session. So there will be some time constraints, possibly, depending on how many people are here. So if we start with Fernando for about 15 minutes, then I'll take a couple of questions, if anybody has questions or comments after that, and then go to Michael, and then back again, so to sort of the floor, as it were, because there might be some parallels to be drawn between the two, the two addresses, and connections to be made. So Fernando, would you like to start?
Yeah, of course, no problem.
Okay. So Chile.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for being here online. Thank you to the organizers. I will skip most of the context because I assume that you know, maybe even better than I do, right? The significance, the historical significance of the government of Salvador Allende, the size and scope of the counter-revolution organized by the Chilean right, General Pinochet, backed by the CIA. I just want to say one thing. The neoliberal project enacted by Pinochet's government didn't have in the Chilean right its best administrators, but in the Chilean social democracy, it found its best administrators. The regime imposed on the dictatorship grew and matured in the 90s, the 20s, the 2010s decades, and ended up exhausting the people of Chile. So, starting more or less from the year 2001, a new cycle of mobilizations started accumulating force and maturing a social program, a political program for social reform, which found its biggest expressions in the students' movement and in the feminist movement in the late 2010s. These projects did not have at their focus the struggle for a new constitution. That was not mainly a widespread demand. So when in October 2019, the uprising began and millions of people launched themselves to the streets to protest, the truth is that the new constitution was not in the first place in the list of demands. The truth is that most of the protests went about the cost of living, the unequitable access to health, to education, housing, and so on.
Afterwards about
Could Peter mute himself, please?
sorry. How do you mute this? Mute.
Yeah, you're muted. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So as I was saying, the uprising did not begin for the constitution, okay? The uprising began for the general discontent of the people of Chile, of the system in general, okay? It was not necessarily connected to the constitution, although it was fairly quickly that the very evolution of the economic program gave rise to the constitution as the main new demand. Now, in the cycle of struggles, I want to highlight two specific dates in 2019. So after October the 18th, one of those dates is November the 12th, okay? On November the 12th, a major general strike was summoned, and that was probably the peak of the struggle of the people in the streets. That day, we pretty much paralyzed the country. It was seen as almost inevitable that we would triumph. At least that's how I and my comrades felt at the moment. So a second general strike was summoned for the next week. We started organizing it, but before we could successfully carry on with it, we come to the second date I wanted to highlight, which is November the 15th, okay? So if in November the 12th, we shook the country with this major general strike, on November the 15th, the political forces of the regime, from the right to Frente Amplio, which is like the new left in Chile, arrived at an agreement which they called the Agreement for Peace and the New Constitution. I want to highlight that no legitimate representative of the people took part on it. The most left-wing person to take part on it was the former member of parliament and now president of Chile, Gabriel Boric. This agreement was not in first well received by the people who attempted to continue the struggle, but the truth is that the strength of spontaneity was also the weakness of the movement, because starting from that agreement, it was rather easy to channel all the strength and energy of the mobilization into the institutional arrangement, and thus the energy of the process began slowly to disperse. After that, any attempt to reconstruct the movement, you must take into account that in the Southern Hemisphere, we have the seasons backwards. So after December, we have the summer, which is, of course, a very complicated moment for mass demonstrations. But any attempt to reconstruct the energy for mobilization on March was suppressed by two things. First, this institutional constituent process, and second, the COVID-19. We will never know what would have happened if it hadn't been for the corona. That's just matter for speculation. What we do know is that any reminder of popular energy after the beginning of the constituent process was finally suffocated by COVID. So, in the concrete functioning of the Constituent Assembly, I want to highlight two main features that could be part of the explanation for the defeat. As you may know, the referendum was defeated in the end, 62 against 38. The first thing I want to highlight is that even though, what's that? Well, anyways, even though we had a left majority in the convention, we did not have a unified program. So the left majority wasn't really clear as to what to do with its majority. So we had the majority, but we did not have the political initiative, I would say. The second thing I want to say, and this may be even more crucial, is the weak relation of the left in the convention with the energy of the social movement. And to explain this, I have to go back in time a little bit, because maybe one of the most powerful things about the Chilean uprising was not just the demonstrations on the street that took place every day in every city of Chile for more than 2 months, but the main strength, the most powerful thing, was the spontaneous formation of a wide range of citizen assemblies, popular assemblies, and different organisms of self-organization in different places of Chile. These assemblies actually continued working after the COVID started, and they were part of the basis for the system of solidarity with which the popular classes of Chile faced the economic scarcity that came along with the pandemics. So these assemblies were, at least embryonically, I would say, pointing to more direct forms of democracy. They could have been the pivotal point which joined the institutional process of the Constituent Assembly with the energy of the mobilizations in the streets. They actually demanded channels for participation, but with some exceptions, most of the deputies to the convention did not really take it as their task to connect these popular assemblies with the Constituent Assembly. So, suffocated by COVID and by the disdain with which the Constituent Assembly treated these assemblies, they finally got dissolved eventually. So let's not go into details of what happened within the convention. Just let's stay with this idea of that even though the left had the majority, it didn't have a unified program to exercise that majority about. And the final product of the Constituent Assembly was not largely perceived as the people's project, but it ended up being perceived as the product of the politics. You know how in these times of exhaustion of formal democracy, people usually don't even care to distinguish too carefully between the different nuances of the institutionalist politics. They just treat everyone as part of the same block. I would say that what happened is that the product of the Constituent Assembly was perceived as the product of the politicians, not as the product of a legitimate popular assembly. So what was the content of the Constitution ended up being less important, I would say, than how it was perceived by the majority of the people. And of course, it must be said that mainstream media, corporate media, which in Chile is very largely concentrated in the hands of a few business people, played a crucial role in further expanding a bunch of misinformations about the Constitution and its content. And eventually we got to the result that we all know. That is, 62% of the people voted against it. And even though it enacted some progressive rights, most of the people that could eventually have been benefited by it didn't embrace it and rejected it. That's like a very fast summary of 2 years of political history in Chile. Now, what lessons can we draw from this? Before I go into that, I would like to say that the stage in which we are now is rather despairing, because instead of closing the process, the government, now run by Mr. Gabriel Boric, decided to open a second constituent process, but this time without any, by minor which it was, this time without any glimpse of popular struggle and demonstrations in favor of it. So it's like a purely superstructural process, which, as one could have expected, was hegemonized by the far right of Chile. They are called the Republican Party. They are pretty much the same as Bolsonaro, the same as, well, with some differences, but very similar to Javier Milei too. So in 3 more weeks from now, we have a new referendum in which the question is, should we remain with Pinochet's constitution or with an even more reactionary one? That's the stage we are in now. And of course, the triumph of Javier Milei in Argentina is not a very good omen for us, because I would say the reason why people voted for Javier Milei is pretty much the same reason why the far right of Chile got to hegemonize this project. And that is that faced with the administration of the neoliberal regime by the Social Democrats, who only give austerity and not many solutions to the real problems that people are facing. I mean, what else can be expected but a vote against whoever sits in power, right? It remains to be seen if Milei has really the popular support that he thinks to have, or if that was just a punishment vote against the Peronistas in Argentina. That remains to be seen. Anyways, as for the lessons we could draw, there is one question that has not left my mind ever since 4th of September of 2021, which is the day in which the referendum was lost. Could it have been different? Were we doomed from the very moment that the constituent process was open, in the sense that there is something intrinsic to the state that makes it undefeatable, or we just played bad our cards? The answer is, I still don't know. But there is one thing I do know. We could have done at least two things differently. First, we could have had an actual political program to bring forward before engaging in such level of institutional arrangements for a new constitution. There was absolutely no clarity of what to do with the state, how to tactically maneuver in the state, with what slogans, with what minimum points. We didn't have that clarity, and thus we didn't have the political initiative. And we thus got absorbed by the intrinsic times of the state. And second, I do know this, if the citizen assemblies that spontaneously emerged during the social uprising had been incorporated in some way to the constituent process, it would have been very different. People would not have felt it as an alien process. People would not have been convinced by the lies of the mainstream media if they had been part of the process. And maybe even we could have overflown the narrow horizons of this institutional process with real direct democracy. Again, we don't know if we were doomed from the beginning, but we do know what we did wrong. I guess at least we can expect to do it better next time, if we ever have a next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Fiona, yeah, you're the facilitator.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Thank you, Fernando. That was really, really interesting. I just have one question about, was there any kind of demographic split in the voting for the Constitution? I mean, did young people who were probably most of those who were involved in the initial protests in 2019, did they vote? Were they more inclined to vote for the Constitution than the older generation, or was it straight right across the board, kind of a disillusionment?
So the vote against the new constitution won in most demographic sectors, in most geographic constituencies too. So yeah, we cannot say that it was like a demographic split that explains the defeat. There are some tendencies, like let's not go into much detail, but young people tended to vote more in favor, but the numbers were still of defeat in that demographic sector. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Anybody else got a question or comment to make to Fernando? Oh, have a question. Oh, you need to unmute.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I have a question, maybe a follow-up, depending on how you answer. What you just described as the Constitution. I mean, if you think of the content of the Constitution the Chileans voted on, did you personally think this is a good thing? What was your opinion of that thing people were supposed to vote on?
That's an interesting question. I had my reservations, of course. Some parts didn't convince me completely, but I acknowledge it as an advance, a huge advance, because at least in my view, a constitution will not solve the problems of the people by itself. but it could open more struggle, more terrain for struggle, and I think it did open them.
Okay, but that would doesn't that mean that it's like, what can I say? It's a theoretically good thing that in practice didn't convince anybody. Well, because, like, you know, it's better than the thing that we had, but not good enough to convince people to actually accept it. Would that be, or is this just, you know, mean saying it like this?
Yeah, no, I understand. I think that, I mean, for me personally, anything short of a socialist constitution would not convince me completely. But of course, we understood that we could not put that in the table in that moment.
Yeah.
So the question was, tactically speaking, what middle grounds could secure some advancements while opening the gate for further struggle? And read in that key, I was very satisfied with the constitution. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yvette
Yvette
and then Yvette. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so can I summarize it like that? So you get into some compromise in order to gain tactical advantage, but then you're totally lost, because your summary is, if we would just go for citizens' assemblies, they will turn over everything, but we got to try to push the constitution that actually didn't go anyway.
Yeah, I mean, these citizen assemblies were not like mature to take the power in their hands or anything sort of it, but they did have the potentiality, I would say, to at least take the process in their hands. And that might have also influenced the content. I'm not sure, but I would think so. But they would have influenced the process. And that for me was the key factor of the defeat, the form of the process rather than the content of the process.
That's the ideological differences between us, I would say. I will point out.
Yvette, hi, Yvette.
Yeah, firstly, hello everyone. It's nice to see some people I met almost 10 years ago on the street in London. It's nice to see some of you guys. I have I know it's quite challenging to explain in less than 20 minutes, let's say, the last 10-15 years in Chile in terms of the political movements and social movements progressing and transforming in many ways the landscape of our country. But I think there are some aspects that is important to acknowledge, and this is something I'm going to link with the question of the state, because the tradition of popular assemblies and territorial assemblies began with the student movement in 2006. And even before 2011, there was a really interesting movement happening in southern Chile, Magallanes, called the Territorial Assembly of Magallanes. So in many ways, the student movement provided a legacy of new ways of building and doing politics. In 2011, what is interesting about the Chilean student movement in 2011 is that they set up territorial assemblies. And since then, the way in which, people organize is like, having territorial assemblies, or sometimes people call in Spanish cabildos, like citizen assemblies and stuff like that. And even when we acknowledge that, Chilean civil society has been mobilized, not all Chilean society, but at least, a group of civil society quite linked to struggles such as the ones raised by the student movement, but also health reforms, pensions, environmental activism, etc. For many activists quite involved in social movements, the key question is that they haven't defined what kind of a state they want to have, even when they were in the peak of mobilizations, for example, in 2011. And I think one of the points here is, to some extent, also addressing the question by Fiona about demographic in the Constitutional Assembly. It's not an easy word to pronounce in English, plus it's 8:30 p.m. But it was quite an interesting experience to see and to acknowledge that this Constitutional Assembly was able to produce the most progressive feminist constitution, you know, and that was really an interesting point. And it's interesting that sometimes we overlook the fact that this was a feminist constitutional proposal, and reasons why we lost and the way in which we lost is so complex. I mean, no one so far has provided a very comprehensive analysis of why we lost in the way in which we lost in 2022. But definitely there are so many aspects here. And one of these is the fact that, yes, the pandemic changed everything. And even in terms of political conditions, if the pandemic didn't happen in 2020, probably the referendum for and for approving or rejecting this new constitution wouldn't happen during Piñera administration, which changed everything in terms of the perspective of being approved. But also there is a recognition of how the pandemic undermined, for example, the possibility of continue being involved in territorial political work in Chile, because lockdown, everything was absolutely impossible to do that. So there is a couple of things here that we need to really consider in terms of understanding, why we lost this constitutional or this referendum. Because again, if we go back to the experience, the accumulation of political experience grounded since 2006 and so forth, we also have probably the most progressive constitution in terms of strengthening local democracy at different levels. And that was also a really interesting exercise, because I read the constitution and it was really, really challenging. I mean, perhaps at that moment, the key questions were how these ideas about having a more participatory democracy at the grassroots levels with institutions, etc., could be, translated into effective policies, and who could really, be involved in that decision process.
Sorry, Eva, could
I need to stop. Yeah. Yeah.
We just no, you can come back again later. Peter, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a bit more about these popular assemblies, the citizens' assemblies. I think you said that they developed spontaneously in every city in Chile, and I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that and how they came together, and how did they have? How were they organized? Did they have some kind of political leadership? And was it COVID that actually stopped the development of these assemblies, popular assemblies? That's my question.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Yvette. So just one thing about Yvette's comment, which I share 100%. It was so feminist an assembly that it even had among its rules the parity of composition between men and women. And it enacted a lot of very interesting rights, reproductive rights, sexual rights, rights of care. But even demographically, women also voted against. So that's also an element to analyze. It's very complicated what happened there. And yeah, we still lack a comprehensive analysis on how and why we lost. As to the citizen assemblies, I can talk about my direct experience in my local assembly. It didn't have the leadership of any specific party. Actually, there were some anti-party slogans, like in Spanish it rhymes, but translated to English, it would be the people united, advanced without parties. So it's like an explicit rejection of the idea of political parties. Even some people that came with the banner of the party got kicked out. Like people didn't want any party without distinction. My assembly at least was organized around the tasks of the mobilization. So like provide security, provide infrastructure, provide basic healthcare for people who got injured and so on. And there were some coordinations for the assemblies along Chile. So at some point, there even was a large assembly of assemblies organized with deputies from most of Chile. And that was a very interesting development. Mm-hmm. I think, again, that hadn't it been for the corona, we would have seen at least a parallel development of this coordination of local assemblies along the constituent parties. But again, that just would be speculation, because corona actually did happen and it ended up suffocating the movement, along with the disdain with which the formal constituent assembly treated the citizen assemblies. And as for the question that Nika is writing right now in the chat, when I say they weren't mature, I mean they weren't mature enough to call for the power to the Soviets. Of course, they were mature enough to take some tasks that they could have taken, but nobody took it as a serious political motivation to foster them into doing so. And the voting process for the new constitution, well, it was just one person, one vote.
So COVID has a lot to answer for.
Yeah.
Penny, did you want to say something, Penny?
Yeah. I just I wanted to say something about the responsibility to nurture assemblies and popular movements as being the main responsibility of revolutionaries. A slightly different experience in Scotland in 2014, we had a referendum on independence. It was quite a simple question, vote yes for independence or no. There was a massive assumption on the part of the establishment that the vote would be no, and that Scotland would vote to stay in the United Kingdom. As the referendum drew close, it became increasingly clear that this was not the case, that it was going to be incredibly close. And the thing that happened was the emergence of a thing which was called the Yes Movement. And the Yes Movement was, it was a popular movement. It was political because a referendum on independence is essentially a political decision. But it brought together people from all sorts of backgrounds and people and political parties, and they were not allowed to bring their political parties to bear on the Yes Movement. There were huge meetings, massive popular meetings of a kind that hadn't been seen in Britain in 30 years. And as you know, the referendum was it was very close. It was 45% voted to leave. So the decision was to stay in the UK, but it was incredibly close. And then as soon as the referendum was over, the left completely abandoned the Yes Movement and even abandoned their left grouping within that movement, the Radical Independence Campaign, and launched some new parliamentary initiative to stand in the parliamentary elections that were coming up, and they got no votes, basically. And so I would say that, the biggest gain from that referendum ought to have been the lessons of building a popular movement in Scotland and people coming together in the way that they did, in this incredibly democratic way. And unfortunately, the decision was really just to ditch it, because I don't know, electoral politics were more attractive in the end, I guess. And keeping that movement going would have been incredibly hard, of course. It would have been really difficult. Would have had to find a new purpose, new structures, and so on and so forth. So it's a sort of similar experience.
Thank you, Penny. Yeah. Anybody else who hasn't spoken would like to put in a word? Nika, we've seen you've added comments.
Michael's got his hand up, Fiona.
Did you want to?
Michael's got his hand up.
sorry. And we need to get back to Michael as well for his.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest that maybe it would be good as a format, and I was going to do a little 5-minute kind of presentation on the Graeber's approach, and then return to this conversation, maybe perhaps enriched. So the point isn't to end this conversation, but to kind of put it up. And I don't know if this is the right time, but I can certainly.
Okay, we'll take. Yeah. The thumbs up from Nika. Yeah. Okay, Michael. Take it away, as I say.
Okay, so this is not in any way a response to Fernando, who's it's quite different. I'm just sort of giving a little summary of some of the readings that we put together, and hopefully people have had a chance to look at them, both of the ones that Paul and me and a couple other people put together the first time, and then also these ones that are specifically on democracy. So this relationship state and democracy that we're trying to explore. And the first one was Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, the section on democracy. So pages 82 to 95. And in this, it really begins with David Graeber writing about the anti-globalization movement, which was really a response of people at a global level all around the world to the huge imposition of new trade laws that were meant to put large corporations and banks in charge and regulating all of the trade for the financial benefit of a very few people. And so we had a huge resistance movement. And after the sort of collapse of the Doha trade agreement in Seattle, people went out and had occupied the streets, they'd marched, and they said, this is what democracy looks like. And it was a chant, right, for people marching down the street. And so that was a key message for the anti-globalization movement, developing a new idea of what democracy was. And then David Graeber goes in this writing to kind of look at what is democracy. This movement was really saying democracy equals direct action, which is very much different than this image of, oh, one person, one vote, and when you have a majority, you win, right? And he looks at the sort of history of anthropology, the history of these words like democracy. He says, in anthropology, it's quite clear that since the beginning of time, you had small groups of people that worked in communities, and they had to organize something. They didn't have the power to say, okay, this is a decision made, now you go do it, and you people do it. And there was an imposition that it had to happen. It was actually, once you made a decision, then the people who had made the decision had to go out and implement it. So it obviously makes no sense to kind of have a vote and have an argument, right? Where half the people would disagree. Someone would say, this is my motion, and I disagree with their motion. And then when they win, oh, we have a majority, we win, right? Because you're now supposed to implement what you've done, and you're basically telling about half the people, well, I'm not going to participate in that. And so you're basically ruining the possibility of being successful. So in most small groups where there isn't the power of imposition, then decision-making becomes by consensus, very much negotiating, bringing people into a group where that will all, as much as possible, agree on the common outcome and then be able to implement it. And that, and so he goes into this history of this as arguably that the anti-globalization movement did, was they argued that it was from the feminist process, and the feminist process had taken a lot from the Quaker process, and the Quakers had argued that this is what the Iroquois used. But from David Graeber's perspective as an anthropologist, this process happens all the time, all over the world, in communities where there isn't an imposition, right? And so the history of this word democracy was really that we would have was really taken from the Greeks as a kind of classical framework of democracy, where you have majoritarianism. And David Graeber puts forward the thesis that the idea of a majority vote democracy was really a military strategy, that if you had soldiers and 60% of them voted one way and 40% of them voted the other way, you could pretty much tell how things were going to go because they all had swords. The 60 were going to win. So it was better just to agree, and that was it. And then when there was this implication of violence, you could impose a majority decision like that and still have things be successfully made. And so that is the type of democracy that finally gets imposed. Although people talk about the West as loving democracy and trace it back to ancient Greece, you see Christian's here, and he's running the reading group that we're doing on the collapse of antiquity, and Michael Hudson's argument that the real reason that we trace our ancestry of the West from Greece and Rome is that Roman law imposed debtors' rules on the rest of the world, and those people who were debtors didn't want real democracy, and they opposed democracy. Some of the other readings, the mob begins to think and reason. I think that might have been linked somewhere. And there never was a West, or democracy emerges from the spaces in between. Go into some of these types of debates, and like, what is the history of democracy in America? America saying that basically original people thought democracy was a bad idea, and it only came to eventually take place because there was such popular resistance to rulership, and eventually became the rhetoric when they kind of tamed democracy into a system where you voted, and you didn't even vote for something that you'd put together. You voted for representatives, and those representatives were always part of the elite groups. And so it was really an attempt to tame and undermine the whole concept of people making decisions by themselves, that the American, and this is that America is in fact a republic rather than a democracy per se. So the other reading here, I'll be trying to be briefer on this. Why did the movement refuse to make demands was a little section in Graeber's book, The Democracy Project. And I wasn't in New York. I was vaguely a participant in the London one, but not in a central role. And so this was in that book, page 87 and 98. And you basically, he talks about journalists coming to him saying, why aren't you making demands? This is, you have to be a mature movement and engage with the political process. And he really says, like, one, that engaging with the political process would have immediately made us a failure. And that the experience of young people had already, he says this on page 91, young people saying, I played by the rules, and what did it get me? I'm in debt. And you had a huge debt politics of huge numbers of people in America suddenly in this massive amounts of debt where their equity had collapsed and all of these things. And they knew that they couldn't follow the rules, because if they followed the rules, they had a creditor, and their creditor was just going to collect. It was just like following the rules is open yourself up, mouse to a cat or fly to a spider. They were going to pounce. And so that's where that movement really refused to do things. The parallel, of course, was the Tea Party, which was an oppositional party, and they did play by the rules because they could play by the rules. The Tea Party was really a debt collector party. They talked about, throwing the tea in the harbor, but really what they meant is we want the laws of private property protected, and that was kind of the rules. So banks were bailed out, people were not, and this is why people said, look, that's what the rules are. We're not going to play by them. I would love to hear other people who were part of that in New York City movement to say what they felt was going on. That would be great. There was a couple of readings and links to that kind of stuff. I wasn't there. And unfortunately, this is Thanksgiving. So most of them are, culturally inappropriate day for us to have picked. And I should know this because I grew up in America. But I'll let people, that's all I wanted to say. And I can take any specific questions, but then we should roll into the the discussion and comments on both this reading, but also on the discussion about how people organize in
Thanks, Mike.
Chile.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, Fernando, do you see parallels there in terms of Occupy in New York and elsewhere? I mean, Occupy was everywhere, presumably, including Chile. And the way that I think you said, Michael, they didn't want to engage with the political process. But in Chile, it was kind of, unless I'm kind of got it the wrong way around, it was almost the same thing in reverse, because the popular assemblies were pushed out by the Constituent Assembly. You know, the mainstream pushed in Chile, whereas in New York, it was the alternative people, the anarchists of Occupy and so on, who didn't want to engage with the mainstream. If I got that right. And in Chile, it was the mainstream sort of were very contemptuous of the popular assemblies and the young people and so on.
Yeah, I would say there's two moments. In one first moment, people didn't want to engage. They just wanted to oust everyone. And the mainstream managed to secure their entry to the formal process. Then when the process was formally open, it was just a formal thing. And then they kicked the people out of the participation. So it was like a twofold movement, right? First, people didn't want to engage, but they got engaged. And then they took the formal channeling of the mobilization, but without the energy of the people, which was expressed in the assemblies.
So I might just comment, you mentioned 2 days right at the beginning, the November 12th is this big giant strike.
Yeah.
November 15th as the agreement for peace and the new constitution. And that was started entirely by the politicos of the Republican process and of the old constitution, and many of them the right wing. And they, like, what was going on in their mind was that them saying, oh my goodness, we're going to lose unless we intervene to do something. And they were cutting their losses by reintroducing a process that they could say, this is the revolution, but they controlled it. So you engage with our process. I don't know what you think about that, Fernando, but I took that to be part of your analysis already.
So the part in which the right-wing Republican Party takes over is like in the second constituent process. But on the other things you said, I would say, yeah, like, because at that moment, in the major strike of November 12th, I would say that one of the biggest demands on the street was the resignation of the president. And I would say the office got shaken so bad that they saw in this constituent process like the only opportunity for them to prevent a major political event to happening, which would have happened probably if next week's second general strike would have been summoned. So yeah, it was kind of a maneuver facilitated by some on the left, but designed by the right on the presidency.
We've got some people that we haven't got their pictures, Elena, Guillermo. I don't know if any of you wanted to make a comment or have a question. Or anybody else who hasn't spoken? Oh, Karina.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. And thank you, Fernando, and also Michael and Yvette. It's from what Yvette and Fernando described of the rising of the popular movement of assemblies. It seems like it was a very spontaneous thing, first of all, with the student movement, and then spreading more widely these territorial assemblies that you described, Yvette. From what you've explained, and it looks like the general movement was way ahead of any political leadership in terms of its desires and its potential to do something. But from what you say, Fernando, it was the social democracy that then discredited itself by really implementing even before this, the Pinochet program. And it seems like the social democracy was way on the wrong side of all of this. And so what was there left for people to, in terms of, there was no political leadership that could actually take this movement forward. And that's what it sounds like, the way you've described it. There was no understanding that the question of power was really being posed by the mass movement, and that potentially it could have been a situation of dual power, which didn't in the end come to fruition. And the initiative was taken by the Republican right wing in the absence of any other leadership, except to try and disconnect the mass movement from the parliamentary electoral aspect of things. I just want to reply to Michael, because I don't, because to confine democracy to representative democracy would be an injustice to democracy, because it was not, as Penny put in the chat, it was not what we would call representative democracy. It's more a form of direct democracy. And also it wasn't particularly Western or Greek. It came from the eastern side of Greece, Turkey originally. And there was forms of democracy in India in the 6th century BC as well. So I think
I'm only just saying.
Anyway,
I was only just saying that the history of the West, the mythology of the West,
yeah, of course it is.
back to that one.
They've appropriated it. You're right. They've tried to appropriate it. You're absolutely right, and they've made it to something they wanted it to be. But that does connect up with this question of why these assemblies, and I mean they were knocked back. The assemblies were knocked back, weren't they? And they were minimalized and taken away from any. The potential that was there was lost. That's what it sounds like from how you describe it. That's my question. Was that what happened?
So is the question directed at Michael or at?
I think maybe Yvette.
Maybe Yvette and Fernando more than Michael, because it's the way they described this movement and how it was destroyed by not destroyed but lost.
I mean, actually, I have a question to Fernando that maybe is also linked to the point that Karina just said, because you have been, you have portrayed the first Constitutional Assembly as the kind of space where the mainstream politics took place, but actually it was the most popular and diverse space. I mean, we didn't only have feminist activists coming from social movement and former students, leaders that were part of the student movement. Also, when you see the composition of the Constitutional Assembly that was set up in 2020, the right-wing political party were expecting to at least get, a majority of 50% in this assembly, and they lost. And they lost this. And they were, for the first time, they were minority. And you don't only have feminist activists, former student activists, but you also have indigenous representatives. So there was the most diverse group in that sense. It was perhaps the most representative space for what, as Chileans, we are. You have indigenous, you have independent, you have feminist, you have students, you have even representatives from other struggles, from environmental activism, etc. So I think since the day one, there was a clear political campaign to in many ways undermine the possibility even that the assembly has a physical space where they could function. We were talking about pandemic, and you needed certain regulations like space, distance, etc. And I think what happened with the assembly was they spent the 6 months preparing a document about how they should work. And maybe that is something could link to some of the points raised here, is the extent to which this momentum was able to connect with previous experiences of being organized, spontaneously on local assemblies, territorial assemblies. But that was about preparing the let's say the constitution for the next 50 years. So they needed to really set up the legal framework about how they will be organized. And in that process, who was leading the process was an indigenous woman. She was elected as the president of the Constitutional Assembly. But what happened after that was, of course, it was let's say brutal far-right political campaign by media to basically to undermine the legitimacy of these different representatives, different delegates. There was also a lack of political articulation between those delegates and their own territories and political spaces. When the final proposal was presented, there was just 1 month to talk about this proposal, and something I was writing on the chat is that how many delegates that were talking about, or they were intending to talk about the proposal, they couldn't talk about the proposal itself because all the time they were inviting to talk on radio, TV, etc. They were basically debunking the fake news around many things, and basically what the far-right politics did quite well was install fear about losing your own house because the state is going to decide if you have one house or two houses. The question about having access to having the right to choose what kind of education you want for your children, etc. And I think if we can have a kind of very clear understanding about the reasons why we lost that momentum and that moment is because in many ways the result also unveiled how neoliberal the Chilean society still is, how neoliberalism is still kind, here in the mindset of Chilean people. And even the question so far right now is how you were as an activist working with communities and trying to explain it's good to have a public health system, and young people that were under the 25 were telling you, but I want to have private health, I want to have this kind of services. So there was a lot of question of how deeply neoliberal Chile still is, and I think that was also a kind of aspect that could explain that momentum. And then what happened after September 2022, I think is something similar about what Penny was describing in Scotland, the kind of, let's say silence that happened after Scotland lost the referendum. In this case, Chile lost having a new constitution, and really, being literally, how do you say it, excluded, particularly all those delegates that were quite active in the process of preparing this constitution. They were literally excluded from having any chance to participate in the second constitutional process, which, by the way, was also a really interesting political strategy managed by the left, particularly by the far left, that called for no voting in the second process that happened. I think it was last May, and I think the abstention in the second process was the third political force, and that make the possibility that far right wing politics came to design and to write a very conservative a new new proposal that is the one who's going to be voted in December. And at that moment, exactly like Penny said, that left that was, campaigning for abstaining and no vote disappear from the conversation,
Thank you, Yvette. Kristen, did you want to say, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, thank you. So thanks.
Paul had his hand up too.
Oh, sorry,
Thanks,
Paul. Paul? Oh, he's gone.
He'll be back, I'm sure.
Off.
Okay. So
sorry.
thanks again for all these very interesting perspectives. And I mean, these are topics people are talk about, let's say in the left, however you want to define that, which I will get to in a moment. If I were to like try and pull the camera back a bit, I mean, if we're being honest with each other, we'd have to look back at a decade of defeats, globally speaking. I know I'm probably gonna get a few people angry at me now, but this is the reality. All the left movements of the last 10, 15 years, in the end, you could say it's the revolutions that didn't happen that defined the last 10, 15 years. And it might boil down to the question of power, you know, not necessarily if individuals want to take power, but do the left in any way you want to constitute that, whether it's and how they are organized, whether it's strictly hierarchical or horizontal, to say like, we're going to take power here. We will make sure the people on the right will not make the decisions anymore. I'm not saying there's a definite way to have this, but the problem we are facing, I think, is that the opposition is always heavily armed. So when Michael was talking about these ways how assemblies of persuasion were used in other times and other places, again, this is a moment when you actually don't have like lots of people with guns bearing down on you. And if we take one of David's favorite examples, which is the pirate ship, of course, when there's a battle, there's a captain, you know, because it's life and death. And in a way, I have this feeling like this is always the case. When you really want to change the system, when you really want something different, there will be a heavily armed opposition who will oppose you. I mean, when Corbyn looked like he was going to maybe voted in, you know, some general went on TV and talked about a coup, you know. I mean, it's just the UK in 2020 something, you know, it's completely ridiculous if you think about it. I mean, and if you look at successful left-wing movements of the recent past, you know, the thing that probably most people that comes to mind is the civil rights movement. And I guess a lot of people would say this is, you know, not some Stalinist or Leninist movement, but it was very hierarchical. They had a program, they had a party, had an organization that stood behind it. And the problem, to me, it seems, is when we have all these spontaneous organizations, all this people power that spontaneously assembles in the squares, that the energy just dissipates. And, you know, the right, the opposition is always organized. They always have resources. They always are ready to move in and pounce. And in the absence of you offering something, whatever that might be, they'll offer something else. And if you don't fill this vacuum, the other people will fill the vacuum. So when you have the historical chance, and these don't come very often, you really have to push and you have to be ready to push. That seems to me a little bit the problem here. And the other thing is like the left, you know, how left is the left? You know, historically speaking, if you like, I'm German, you know, if you look at the failed revolution in Germany, Liebknecht and Luxemburg were murdered by Noske, who was the Minister of the Interior, and he was in the SPD at the time. And another example, the abandonment of the Yes movement in Scotland, that's also very good if you're on the political left, because you're kind of in the system, right? And I see that again now in Germany with the coalition that was voted in before the war in Ukraine. And, you know, the Greens don't really much resemble the Greens as they started out, because an essential feature of the Greens in Germany was that they were a peace party. And that was completely abandoned. You know, they're not even able to push through a speed limit on the Autobahn anymore. You know, they are mostly interested in upping the budget for the military these days. And finally, when we're talking about the left, I mean, this year, we are all in our bubble here, right? We are all very bubbly, very lefty people. And if you say like the people on the street didn't want the constitution in Chile, does that maybe mean, you know, they're not as progressive as the constitution is? And what does that mean, actually? You know, this is the question. I'm not saying that like this constitution was the most progressive, the most feminist and all that. And I'm not saying these are not values that are important, but do the people, however you may want to define them actually want that, or do they just want cheap housing and healthcare and education? You know what I mean? I mean, these are really political realities. And finally, and then I'm done with my little monologue here. When you said like maybe COVID killed the movement, you know, we didn't have COVID in the Arab Spring, we didn't have COVID in the other, and they all went nowhere. And I mean, this is unfortunately, look, I'm happy to be persuaded that I'm wrong, but if I'm looking at the last 15 years, it's 15 years of defeats. The right is more in power than ever. Neoliberalism hasn't really been broken. You know, you see right-wing parties being voted in every government, and you know, so I'm kind of left with, and I've talked to quite a few people, and look, I'm going to say something really bad now. I feel, not that look, my heart is very much with David, you know, but talking to people and looking at these things that happened in the last 15 years, I wonder if we won't see like the strong comeback of Lenin on the left. You know, not that I'm happy about this or anything, but you know, the other stuff doesn't seem to work. And in the end, you're left with Lenin and Mao, right? Unfortunately.
We need that cold shower there that you gave us. Thank you, Christian. Nika.
Yeah, thank you.
I've had my hand up for about 10 minutes, by the way.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Paul, you go first.
Yeah, Paul.
I just a few points. I agree a lot with what Christian has said. When you're confronted with the possibility of power and the opportunity for power, then if you don't take it, you pay the price. You pay the price. And sometimes that price is paid in blood. And that's what happened, in my view, with Allende. The opportunity was there, but it was looked at in the face and turned away, and the faith was put in the army to protect the government. But this is the army led by Pinochet. So, you know, and that, I think that politics of social democracy was and the Communist Party of Chile was very influential in turning the movement away from assemblies as a potential route to power towards the idea of constitutional reform. And this was not a new constitution. This is constitutional reform. This is reforming of the existing state to allow the existing state to function more liberally at the best. But it's still the same state in the same power in the hands of that state. So, I mean, the situation in Chile, as you said, Christian, is a story of history going back to Luxembourg and Liebknecht, the way they were murdered in the German Revolution by social democracy. It happens to be social democracy at that point. And so unless we're going to face up to these things, this will be repeated time and time again. If you have the power, then you have to have a strategy for actually winning that power. And it won't happen, with all due respects, it is not a spontaneous event. It never has been in history. Whether it's a bourgeois revolution or socialist revolution, it doesn't happen spontaneously. The bourgeoisie didn't come to power spontaneously. In America, they made their revolution and their civil war and all the rest of it. So unless we can face up to that, then the present state is doomed to rule forever. Unless we have a strategy to defeat that state on a lasting basis, we can't succeed. And I don't agree with Michael that the response, the anti-globalization movement was sidetracked by post 9/11. It was sidetracked by the absence of this question of how do we socialize the corporations and how do we have a political power that will do that. It came to that point where we knew what the enemy was, but how to actually defeat the corporations and defeat the state that created the neoliberal framework. It had no answers. And so it was vulnerable to being sidetracked by, as you say, the post 9/11 wars and all the rest of it. But, you know, it got to the top of the hill and couldn't answer the question. And this is the question we have to answer, because we're in this new period now, in my view, of incipient kind of international war, a breakdown of economy, and dictatorships emerging all over. we have to answer this question pretty soon, in my view. And I think this is the task we have to face up to. Sorry for that monologue.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, we needed to hear that. Definitely. I mean, the Netherlands has now gone way to the right as well, or possibly will, although he may not be prime minister, but it's still another grim reminder of how things are going. Nika, did you? Yeah, Nika. Oh, unmute. Unmute.
Yeah, so my question to Paul would be defined who are we who should take out the power, because that will be coming back to Lenin, because apparently Lenin originally was thinking that we are the good guys, you know, and then suddenly, oops, you know, Stalin came over and he was like, no, don't vote for Stalin, he's a bad guy. And Stalin just went and said, yeah, but probably, you know, this story about the Lenin's letter that just, he was about to die, and he just gave a talk to his party friends and tell, like, Stalin has a very alarming qualities, don't vote for this guy. And then Stalin came and told, yes, I think I totally accept the criticism of Comrade Lenin and I will be better. And then we know what happens in Soviet Union. That was pretty bad. The Stalin was, apparently everybody has consensus about that. That's why Lenin is considered to be kind of less evil, but we can see how it all goes. So, yeah, I would say that the question of power, and we are taking that, is apparently, to me, is like a bad recipe. And I will come back to another David's text about Paris Commune, where he was describing how Paris Commune, actually what they did, they demonstrated to everyone how alternative world could look like. And now we're living in a city where whatever they did in Paris Commune considered to be total normal, like 8 hours working day, equal pay between men and women, public transportation, lights on the streets. Apparently all these people were murdered for showing that. But what they didn't do, they didn't, seize the bank, they didn't vote for the power. And so one of the opinion, David's opinion, that if they would concentrate on this, then they will probably, protect the Paris for a while, but would it be actually a commune, and would it be the example for the world? So it's an idea, what is revolution? And for me, still a definition of revolution is rearranging a common sense of how we as a human beings started to think differently, and not how, certain group of people who right now we hope are good guys took over the power, because the power structures is all the same, and we have to rearrange all of them. That's why, coming back to the Fernando very, very impressive description of some amazing things happens in Chile. So if I would be there, if I would be Chilean, I would just try to do my best to help Citizens Assembly run, because we can see that in Rojava, they actually are okay, they're pretty mature to run the whole society. And I don't know if I don't know enough details about Chile. You guys, lots of people from Chile here probably do. So was it a situation when it would be possible to arrange it a direct democracy, if it would be more hope in that?
I noticed it's 19 minutes past 9 and we hope to finish at 9:30, so let's say another 10 minutes. Fernando, did you want to come back on that, what Nika had to say?
I think the best course of action would be that Michael spoke first, and
okay.
maybe I can try to wrap up later, and if there is more things to be said, they can be said, but I would listen to Michael first, maybe.
Oh, okay, right, thanks. Michael.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in relationship to some of these questions about what, how is this that change comes about? And if we really want change to come about by people, all of the people, it is not just getting them to politically agree at one moment. It is, I like very much how Nika put it, to change the common sense that people have, but it also might mean their psychological feelings about many of the issues, their understanding about many of the issues, and that is like includes many of us as well in terms of thinking about how we engage in processes that create much more collective change. I quite agreed with what Paul was saying in terms of it very much might be that at the anti-globalization movement really didn't have some kind of fierce answer to the questions. My point was simply that maybe that was what enabled them to kind of respond. But like in general society, if you break a plate, it breaks in half. It doesn't break into a million pieces. And this is what happens in many ways. If the plate breaks and it's us versus the rich and the powerful, then that's really bad for the rich and the powerful. So they wanted the plate to break in some way. And really what it broke is right-wing oil fanatics in America and the right-wing oil fanatics in the Middle East, and this kind of war. And that played out into a very different dynamic. So I think those are some of the questions that it's a lot deeper to organize things, which has been this kind of common question. How is it that if you want to at least seize power so that things don't get worse because the establishment seize power and then try to get people to change their common sense? And that's maybe another conversation at some point when we have Fernando would be his kind of, I know some people have mentioned his paper on that he's discussed on what is it, the phrase when the dissolution of the state, how the state dissolves eventually. We probably don't have time for that right now, but
yeah, so I would like to reply now, but I will make it short in the sake of time. So I like the diversity of points of view in this conversation because there is like so many inputs from different theoretical traditions that nevertheless I would say that converge in one common theme, and that is that we need to transform society beyond the state, right? I would say we can agree on that. But the thing is, in the present conjuncture, the common sense seems to be very permeated by decades of neoliberal hegemony. So even though we want to dissolve the current state of situations, it seems like we would need to engage the state somehow, some way. For me, the key question is this: what kind of strategy, what kind of institutional design can help us engage the state while at the same time preserving the autonomy of popular subjects and nurturing the spaces of self-organization that emerge spontaneously in the course of protests? Because as I think Yvette said it in the chat, there is always an articulation of spontaneity and consciously organizing, right? Assemblies can emerge spontaneously, but unless an element of consciousness emerges within them, they will likely go, as Christian said, dissolved even without the COVID happening in the middle, right? And I think it's interesting how we actually got one of the most representative and plural assemblies in terms of the composition of its membership. But even though that was the case, the functioning of the assembly got totally isolated from the mass of the people, which kind of tells me that the problem of a constituent assembly is not how to put the best members in it, but how to design it so that it is tied to this broader popular institutionality that emerges in the course of some mobilization. I don't think I have an answer to what is that design that could help us navigate through the state and beyond it, but I think that's like for me, the equilibrium to be achieved. how to design a strategy to engage the state while preserving popular autonomy in the process of its transcendence.
Thank you, Fernando. Well, we're coming to the end. I saw a chat from Penny that we thought we were possibly planning a session on the withering away of the state. So that could be another. Yeah, sorry, Penny, you're up there. So would you like to say a word about that? What you would hope for, from a session to do with the withering away of the state? I didn't see the full all of your text there, but did you just want
no, just the when we were originally talking about these sessions, Michael will recall we did talk about the possibility of having a session on the idea of what lies beyond the state. And this phrase, the withering away of the state, was brought in, but it may not be the best phrase to use, but
right. Okay. Oh, so Nika, you said wasn't talk about engaging the state, only about ignoring it. But can we do such a thing? Ignore the state? Really? Did you want to say? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's not the right time to answer now, but yes, I think that's the right strategy, because my take on the talk of Fernando was that the problem and the mistake was clearly the attempt to ignore, to engage with the state and to play by the rules. And that's exactly what led to the disaster, like clearly. And that's everywhere led to the disaster. And actually Occupy didn't do this mistake. They clearly ideologically rejected all the rules. And that's why very quickly lots of occupied happens everywhere. For example, one of my friends, artists, was laughing on Occupy when it was happening, and they were saying like, "Oh, occupy everything, demand nothing, la la la." But then very quickly, they were the guys who also part of the assemblies whenever they lived and engaged in the lectures. So it's just become a wave everywhere. And I think the ideological position is very important in this case. And ideological mistakes are crucial.
Can I say something? Because I'm from the global south, and I would say that we need to stay there. We need to protect rights. We need to provide sometimes basic things. And I think right now the key question for many political progressive forces in Latin America, for example, is how, because the state is not something that is there just to be occupied. It's also dispute, dispute, for example, by far-right wing politics. And it's going to dispute for progressive politics as well. And think about in countries like Chile, when we're talking about that we were the first experiment with neoliberal transformation, particularly neoliberal state transformation. And now what we're trying to do is to, from within this state that was transformed by neoliberalism, to implement more progressive policies.
But that didn't work. This is not working. We don't talk about.
No, it's working. It's working. I mean, in countries like Chile, where you have the health was privatized, for example, the current government has introduced a new reform, which is basically providing free health for the majority of Chileans that don't have, enough money to do that. And it's the state who's providing that.
So, I think this is a great point. What is the state, right? And of course, we've talked about that before, but the state is your roads. It is, in some sense, the ability to do collectively healthcare, hospital, all of these things that we might together make. And then the state is also a coercive control. So different people, end up in control of the state. And maybe the issue is here is two things. One being when you're dealing with the state as coercive
Right.
control. It isn't just ignore the state, it's ignore their coercive control and continue to
No,
not do
absolutely.
that. If
Mm.
they say, oh, you engage with our process so long as we're in charge, then that's a problem. The other question is, and I think lefty theorists are very always guilty of doing this. If we lost, it must be because we didn't have the correct theory or we didn't engage in the right tactics. Sometimes you lose because that's the way the rules are. Big people win and small people lose. When they have all the structures and the capabilities and the thing, it can be very intimidating. And so I think you take all of these losses as an experience and what can we do next?
Okay, I think that can be obviously a topic that we can take much deeper and further in our next session, whenever that we can get around to arranging that, as Corinna has suggested. So if nobody else has anything important or vital or pressing to add, I think we can bring this session to a close. Everybody agree to that? Thank you all very much. It was great to see you all and to hear you all and all your wonderful ideas. And hello, Yvette, after a long time no see.
Yeah. Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you
for
very much
inviting me.
indeed, Fernando.
Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you guys. Take care.
Okay,
Bye.
right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.